Tim Jackson is a professor of sustainable development at the University of Surrey and director of the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity. Tim Jackson is also the author of the well-known report and book titled Prosperity Without Growth. I'm sure familiar to some of you. And Tim has decades of policy experience, in particular as Economics Commissioner on the UK Sustainable Development Commission. And what you might not know, Tim Jackson is also an award-winning playwright with numerous radio writing credits for the BBC. And among his many other functions, he's also a board member of the KR Foundation. Of course, I would mention that. But for 3 decades, Tim has been one of the most significant voices in the international debate on sustainable economy and development. And today he will share his vision for how we can create an economic system that is sustainable for both people and planet. And Tim, we are very much looking forward to what you want to tell us today. The floor is yours. Warmly welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I suddenly realized today, I came here first to Copenhagen 30 years ago, almost to the day actually, and I came here to look at how Denmark was a shining example in community-based wind energy, which was totally unheard of in the UK at the time. And so it's been for me a kind of fascinating journey. Always involved with that idea of moving to a cleaner technology, and always also involved in the exploration of what it means to be a society and how societies work. And that early learning actually from that community-based wind energy work that I was researching so that I could inform the work that we were doing in the UK, but also that people matter and that society matters. So I remember vividly some of those conversations I had in Jutland with people who had pioneered community energy at that point, and they were such rich individuals, not just in the sense of their technological vision, but also in their sense of what society is, how it works together, how communities are bonded together and create the place in which we as individuals can flourish. And it was those lessons, actually, in some sense, I tried to take them back into the UK at a time that was totally unready for that sort of argument and was almost, I dread to say this, I was almost accused of being a communist. And the people, I was giving evidence at a public inquiry about nuclear power, talking not just about the technology of wind energy, but also about this remarkable example of how communities could come together and build that technology into their lifestyles. And the guy who had commissioned me to do it just tapped me on the shoulder very lightly. And I knew what that meant. It meant don't push these poor establishment, technology-driven, very archetypal politicians too far, Tim. Talk about technology, but don't talk about all this wishy-washy stuff about community and people. And I took that as an early lesson that that's exactly what I should do. I should go away and think about not just technology, but actually what it means to be a society and what it means to flourish. And actually I want to start exactly where Connie indicated we should start, because actually this year is the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the Club of Rome. And I'll be going to Rome actually in a couple of weeks to celebrate it, which is a really nice piece of history. It feels as though we are connected to a tradition that actually came before us and will continue on after us. And being able to speak into that tradition actually is, one of the great joys of being a part of a society. And many people think that the Limits to Growth work was basically trashed, that they got it wrong, that they were predicting collapse by the end of the millennium, so by the year 2000, and by now society would barely exist. And it's a gross misconception of what Limits to Growth was saying. Actually, they were saying that we would begin to move into a period in which the scarcity of resources could be felt in society in around about the 2030s, 2040s. And so that's a dynamic that actually hasn't gone away. And there's nothing much in the way of evidence for us to rubbish the limits to growth work. That idea, in fact, that as you extract more and more resources, it becomes harder and harder to extract the next ton, and you have to allocate more and more of your energy and your economic output to that extraction of resources. And that means you can't dedicate it to health and education and the things that matter in society, and your society begins to suffer. There was such a simple dynamic, it had such a strong physical basis, and it was deeply disliked by everybody who came across it, from that same established political and economic class that saw progress as inextricably linked with economic growth. What the Club of Rome barely touched on, of course, and which is much more familiar to us, is the challenge of what happens to all those resources when they're extracted, put through a production system, used in society, thrown away, burnt up, consumed, worn out. And the biggest element of that, of course, is the question of climate change, the carbon challenge. Now, you don't need me to rehearse numbers here. In Paris, almost 3 years ago, there was an agreement to try to limit carbon emissions in a manner that would keep global warming to well under 2 degrees above the pre-industrial average, and if possible 1.5 degrees. And the arithmetic of that is very, very stark. Essentially, that 1.5 degree scenario in particular speaks of having to decarbonize our energy systems and our society as a whole in the space of less than a couple of decades, unless we draw on technologies which at the moment don't quite exist to suck carbon out of the atmosphere in an effective and safe way. We have to be working on that decarbonization, a huge technological challenge, and I'll come back to the scale of that challenge. In fact, I'll look at it now, because one of the questions that I get asked a lot is we know what these technologies are. Tim, you were in Denmark 30 years ago. You saw the wind turbines, the solar revolution, the biomass. You saw energy efficiency that you couldn't dream of in the UK. All of that has progressed in 3 decades to the point where if you were to ask the question, can technology deliver that degree of carbon challenge, that degree of decarbonization, the answer to the question is that those technologies do exist. They are there. They could be put in place. There are the technologies to decarbonize our electricity system. We're a little short on storage capacity in the meantime, but that's a technological challenge that you could dedicate resources to solving to. Technology is such a critical part of this puzzle. But what people tend to want to do when they ask, can technology solve this for us, is can technology solve it for us without changing anything else? Without changing the way that we live our lives, without changing the way we travel about, without changing our political systems, without changing our financial institutions, without changing the way that we govern a society and think of social progress. And I think the answer to that one is also pretty clear, that technology on its own doesn't do it. And I just want to illustrate that a little bit in a historical perspective, to put in perspective what we're asking in this transition to a low-carbon society. So essentially, if you want to get to a position where by 2030, let's say, the developed economies have reduced their carbon 60 to 70%, and by 2050, we're close to net zero, and you want to do that in a world in which not only are the developed economies growing at 2%, but the developing countries, the poorest people in the world, are able to catch up with that development. a place which is fairer, a world in which the distribution of resource is more equitable, a place in which everybody has the chance for a decent life. So you're growing this economy and you're meeting your carbon targets. Actually, at that point, it becomes about the arithmetic of technology. How fast do you have to decarbonize that system? And these were scenarios that I put together in the second edition of Prosperity Without Growth that was just published last year, which showed that essentially you have to decarbonize globally at a rate of about 14% per year. So your carbon intensity has to fall by around 14% every year, year on year, if we want to have some chance of meeting those carbon targets by 2050. And I thought to myself, well, that, knowing what I know about technology, fine, but how much of that have we achieved historically? So I was interested in the data on the rate of decline of carbon intensity over the last few decades. And this is a picture that shows the answer. It's a little bit messy. These numbers tend to be quite up and down. So a good thing to do is just put a trend line through that. So this is what the trend looks like. So this is the rate at which the high-income countries have decarbonized year on year over that period from the mid-1960s to the 2050. And what you can see there is kind of salutary. This advanced economies, that's us, the technologically most advanced in the world, had a good incentive to reduce their carbon impact and all the knowledge available for them to do it. And actually, the peak of that decarbonization occurred in about the 1970s, late 1970s, through, obviously, in some sense, through the oil shock. The oil shock was a wake-up call that provoked a response in the advanced economies that they should try and decarbonize, move away from this volatile, potentially resource, geopolitically insecure fuel sources and come up with something better. But actually, that peak has not been surpassed since that time. And if you look over the last decade or so, you actually see a decline in the rate of decarbonization that's deeply worrying in the face of the challenge that we face. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things happening in carbon in other parts of the world, so let's just put those on the graph as well. World decarbonization actually went into reverse for a period during the early 2000s. We were not getting more carbon efficient, we were getting less carbon efficient. It's turned a corner again now, and that's largely through the impact of the middle-income countries who have turned that trend around, actually achieving rates of decarbonization which are higher than the high-income countries have ever done, even during that peak. You add in the lowest income countries and you get a sort of mixed picture there. But my point here is that we are asking of this economic system something truly extraordinary in historical terms. And you would think if it was just about technology, we would already have done it. We would have created that transition. We had every incentive to do so. We had all the scientific knowledge. And here then is my answer to that can technology save us challenge. And it is not on its own, not by itself, not without thinking a little bit more clearly about the system in which we live and the kind of economy that we have. Now, Connie introduced me with a very upbeat economic projection for world growth over the next few decades. And my final bit of this first section of the talk, which is all about the challenge that we face, is actually to just place a little question mark over that. We've been talking about the limits to growth for nearly 50 years. We've known about climate change almost for that length of time. The IPCC was constituted in the early 1990s. All the science points in that direction. And nobody has really listened to that argument about the limits to growth during that time. But there's one thing, and it's remarkable, since I was last here giving a lecture almost 10 years ago, just after the first publication of Prosperity Without Growth, one thing has changed in that conversation, and it has nothing to do with people or planet. It actually has to do with the economy itself, and the sense that actually the growth that we believed we could count on just may not be there anymore in the way that it was before. This is the thesis of what's called secular stagnation, a slowing down of the growth rate, particularly in advanced economies. And it's remarkable because it's suddenly drawing the attention of mainstream politicians and of mainstream economists. The idea that the advanced economies may be looking at a slowing down is a real call to arms, a concentration of the mind in relation to the growth-based economy. And it should be, because it's absolutely not appropriate to assume that the past is a reliable guide for the future when big things are happening in the economy. Many people think it's to do with the financial crisis. You'll hear a lot about debt overhang since the financial crisis, about the lack of confidence in market. Labor productivity growth is really the foundation for economic growth. Labor productivity growth is a number which is calculated as the output per hour of worked in the economy. And when labor productivity growth goes up, everything goes well. You produce more and more outputs each year as the economy grows and grows. And because your labor productivity is growing up, you can afford to pay your workers more, which means they have more wages. And because they have more wages, they can spend more in the economy. And that keeps demand growing so that the economy just keeps growing. And that allows us to invest in new technologies which improve labor productivity even further, so that we can keep that virtuous circle, what we believed to be a virtuous circle, going ad infinitum. But actually, the underlying structure of labor productivity growth doesn't look like either a constant level of labor productivity growth that we might like in the economy, nor certainly an increase. What it looks like is a period in history, that there was a time at which labor productivity growth increased from something like 1% to something like 4% in the middle of the 1960s. And although I'm showing you data for the UK, most advanced economies don't differ massively from this picture, that labor productivity growth increased to around about the mid-1960s, and then it began to decline after that. And if you look at all the things that I've written on there, the remarkable things happened during that decline, like the discovery of oil and gas resources where we never knew we had them, like almost the entire technological revolution of information technology, of Apple, of Google, a couple of oil crises, a couple of wars around oil, and then a financial crisis. But there, if I can show you, that is the financial crisis. So anyone looking at that graph and telling me that the financial crisis was the cause for our decline in productivity, I would challenge quite severely. What we're looking at is a longer-term phenomenon. It is interesting that some of that decline in labor productivity happened after the first and second oil crises, or around about that time. It's also fascinating that information technology, new technology, failed to hold up that labor productivity growth decline at all, really, during that period. All of that's irrelevant in the light of the undeniable fact that most advanced economies now have much, much lower labor productivity growth. In the UK, it's virtually zero. In some other countries, it's slightly higher. In the OECD nations as a whole, labor productivity growth on trend would disappear in about 10 to 15 years' time. That is a place where conventional growth, in the way that we had come to think of it, just doesn't exist anymore. It's a much harder territory. It's a place where employers can no longer afford to give wage increases on the back of labor productivity. They must either absorb the cost of those or they must find cheap labor somewhere. So there are deep social implications to what is happening at the moment. And it's this secular challenge that in some sense is the biggest of the post-growth challenges that we face, and it's one that is beginning to attract some political attention. Now, most of that political attention is let's turn that curve back up again. Surely we can do that. It can't be so hard, can it? And of course, there may be technologies that would allow us to shift that and to change that. But when you ask how they will achieve that, much of what's in the toolkit is the kinds of things that we already tried over the last few decades to keep growth going. So Keynesian stimulus, for example, in the immediately pre-war and immediately post-war period was supposed to keep growth growing when demand stagnated. When we ran into the problems of the oil crises and that led to an inflationary period, Keynesianism was thrown out of bed and the monetarists came on board saying the way to keep growth going actually is to increase liquidity, to deregulate the financial sector, to make investment cheaper. And so we put in place an architecture of the financial markets in which money was loose and easily available to those who had access and capital behind it. And it led directly to the financial crisis. The instability that was created in financial markets was causal in the financial crisis. After the financial crisis, we had a brief flirtation with Keynesianism, a little bit of green stimulus, please, thank you very much, that would be nice, and then a retrenchment into austerity, which has withdrawn social investment from those who need it most in society, at the same time as governments and central banks were bailing out financial institutions who were, in some sense, the architects of that crisis. You know, if it comes to keeping growth going, we have tried just about everything. And in the process, we've created inequality, we've failed to invest in green technologies, and we have destabilized financial systems and whole financial markets. Are you really telling me that the answer to this conundrum is to turn everything round, push that curve up again by some policy as yet unknown with potentially enormous destabilizing influences? We're looking 10 years after the crisis at political and social instability. We're looking at increased inequality in advanced nations. We're looking at vast underinvestment in the carbon challenge. We're looking at having to turn that round in a space of decades, and our only history of doing any progress in that direction at all was back in the 1970s when we were faced with an oil crunch. And if that's not a time to think differently about the economy and to think differently about economics, then I don't know what is. I mean, I'm sure in some sense that many of you will agree with me on that point. And so the questions really become, how do we then begin to conceive that different, that new economy? What can we ask both of policy and indeed of society and of course of research, knowledge, and science in terms of changing that dynamic round? And I think, interestingly, it could well be that one of the most important things is just to create the space to have that conversation. So my job is not particularly to give prescriptions about those changes. It is to point out that most of our attempts to keep growth going under those circumstances and deliver social and environmental goals have failed, and that a new kind of thinking is necessary. The evidence on the extent to which, by promoting growth, we've completely undermined some of those goals is quite striking. This is evidence from the United States, convened by Thomas Piketty and his colleagues, and it shows how over the recent decades, which are indicated in red on the graph, The previous trend was completely reversed. This idea that growth would trickle down to the poorest. Actually, if you look at the years from 1946 to 1980, the bottom 1% got the lion's share of the growth in income during that period. In the last decade, since 1980, it's the top 0.001% who got the lion's share of what growth there was to be had, and the poorest deciles got poorer. That's not a situation that can really pertain without a huge degree of social instability, and that, of course, is exactly what we've seen. We've seen, essentially, an economy that doesn't work. We've seen enterprise, which is cast as accumulation, work as a form of servitude, investment almost as a gambling casino, and money as forms of power. We've looked at the privatization of gains for the benefit of the few and the socialization of all the costs of that, including the costs of the financial crisis itself. My challenge, if you like, on the basis of that is can we, without throwing everything that we know away, without simply moving towards a kind of revolutionary expulsion of economics from the field of human knowledge, can we turn that around again? And that has been, I think, to me, the biggest lesson from looking at some of this data. And it really chimes with the idea of what we see as limits. One of the things that offended people after the Limits to Growth was published was the idea that there were any limits on human society. The idea that as human beings we faced limits. Ronald Reagan famously at one point said there's no limits to growth because there's no limits to human ingenuity, which of course is an interesting framing of our sense of social progress and the potential for it, but is completely false in relation to the idea that ingenuity alone can keep a system going when it is so at odds with the physical realities that we live in day to day. And Wendell Berry, in this lovely quote, I think picks that idea up and turns it on its head. He kind of said, this is a misunderstanding of the idea of limits. Limits, properly understood, are not confinements but inducements to fullness of relationship and meaning. So the idea that we could take these limits, the climate change limit, the resource limit, the secular stagnation limit, and turn that on its head and ask the question, how do we create a society in which we induce fullness of meaning and relationship and purpose, is a fundamentally different way of thinking about our economics. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about our politics. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking about the constituents of our economy, those foundations that I had so darkly sketched before are actually things where we can begin to ask the question, what would enterprise look like if it wasn't a form of accumulation? What would work look like if it wasn't just servitude? Work, after all, is a part of the glue of society. Being able to participate as decent citizens in a decent society is an element of what prosperity is. And of course, the reality for too many people is a long way from that. I went to some of the southern European countries just after Prosperity Without Growth was first published, with youth unemployment approaching 50%, and looked around in those environments at the insecurity of those jobs and the sheer waste of human talent and human energy that was going on at that time, particularly in a younger generation of people. It's tragic, but it's also nonsensical, because I looked at those same societies to see whether there was nowhere that people could be working, whether there were no hospitals that were overcrowded or classrooms that could do with more teachers, whether there was no social care in that society that needed to be done, whether there was nothing in the arts or the crafts or in the leisure sector which would enrich people's lives and give them a better quality of life, whether there were no apartment blocks or buildings or offices that could be refurbished, that could be made both energy efficient and nicer places to live, whether there were no communities where you could build community halls and bring people together. And every time, of course, the answer was no. There are millions, myriads of opportunities for work in the economy. What's gone missing is not work itself, but the economic system that delivers that possibility for us to participate in society in the service of other people. So that's my, if you like, and I'm not selling that as a distinct way in which work could or should be organized. I'm selling it as a process of rethinking fundamental things in economics. Should enterprise be thought of as a profit maximization process which drags stuff out of the ground, turns it into products, distributes it to consumers who should own it for as short a time as possible before they throw it away again? It's a nonsensical, dysfunctional vision of what enterprise is, and we can think of it differently. We can think of enterprise as service. This lovely example actually is just a little social community enterprise which brought out a pub in a district in the United Kingdom called the Norfolk Broads, turned the entire enterprise around by putting their savings into it, by working in the pub, by providing a service to the community. It's one amongst millions of examples of ways in which actually enterprise can be reconceived, in which community can be regenerated, in which our economy can be revived. It doesn't necessarily give the same rates of return for shareholders that were expected of Icelandic companies immediately before the Great Recession, but it is the foundation for thinking differently about enterprise and about what economy is. It's a kind of, if you like, a sort of enabling process to do this for oneself, to think through parking all of your personal reservations about utopia, about political impossibility, and just saying, what if it worked in this way? What if enterprise were reconceived in this way? What if work were really conceived as a meaningful participation in society? What if investment, instead of being a gambling casino, was seen as a commitment to the future, defining a portfolio of projects, real investment projects that improved the quality of our lives, that removed the damage that's caused to the environment, that decarbonized our electricity systems, that improved our health systems and our education systems, that gave back stability and resilience to economies? Is it possible to see such portfolios? Actually, it is. There's a very famous Margaret Atwood story that she never put anything in her dystopian novels that didn't exist somewhere in the planet. Now, I think that's quite a good recipe to have. Don't put anything into your utopian stories that doesn't already exist somewhere on the planet. And actually, you can find examples of this kind of fund, of seeing investment as a commitment, of thinking of it in ethical terms, of distributing investment funds to projects which improve the quality of people's lives. And for all the fact that that's clearly not what's going on in the financial centers of the world at the moment under existing regulation, the possibilities for it are enormous, and they are, to some extent, already happening around us. And there are challenges in that, of course. We tend to think of money as power, and the power largely vested in credit creation in banks, which even has to be the basis for funding government finance and government money, on which actually society places trust as its single biggest social value. Governments have trust, and that trust allows them to actually be the arbiters of money as a public good. And yet that has almost entirely been handed over the last few decades to private interests, so that even governments funding, trying to fund the safety net for those who fell foul of the financial crisis and of the austerity cuts afterwards, can only borrow that money at interest from the same people who are being bailed out for the failure in the banking system. And there's something about this process of reconception which allows us actually to cut to the chase and to say it isn't about tinkering with money systems and trying to impose disclosure on financial companies so that they'll finally end up admitting to how much carbon is in the assets that they hold. It is about fundamentally rethinking our economic institutions and having the political courage to talk about that, not just as politicians, not just as scientists, but as ordinary people with a voice in what social progress means. It's a kind of process of thinking transformatively. Instead of this rapacious, extractive economy damaging the planet and causing division, there's a basis of the economy that is built around the qualities that make us human: care, craft, creativity, connection, and a sense of participation in society. Now, that's wonderful as a vision. You can read more about it in all sorts of places, including Prosperity Without Growth, the second edition. But those are not the only things that people challenge me with. They sort of say, yeah, that's lovely, Tim, Cinderella economy, we got that concept, but how on earth do you make that work in an economy? So I want to finish really just by pointing to, very quickly, to three challenges, which I think are real challenges that call on us as citizens and as scientists to be honest about what we do know and what we don't know in relation to them. And the first is, if you like, is the macroeconomic challenge. How do you make the economy work at the macroeconomic level when all this lovely stuff that you want to put in place for a rose-tinted society is actually happening? What does it look like in macroeconomic terms? The second one is clearly a political challenge. Things have changed in the 10 years since Prosperity Without Growth was first published, and it is, for me, almost unbelievable that last week I was in a post-growth conference in the European Parliament, a whole conversation about these issues, which was furiously denied 10 years ago, even by the people for whom I wrote that report, my own government. And then, of course, there's a social challenge as well. So those challenges exist. They call on us to engage in some dirty subjects like economics. And here's my favorite quote about economics. The purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. And it's what I tell that to my students every year. It's the only thing that keeps them coming to economics lessons, because some of them have become so disillusioned with economics as a science that they don't want anything to do with it. I think that's a mistake. I think we have to actually engage with the hardest questions in economics. We have to engage with if our economy isn't growing in the way that we hoped it would before, what does that mean for inequality? What does that mean for the stability of our financial systems? What does it mean for employment? We have to begin to address those questions. What does the economy of care and craft and culture do in order to maintain its resilience, to finance itself, to be sustainable even in economic terms, let alone ecological terms? And just as a very simple example of how you can begin to engage in that, one of the things that's thrown at the zero growth or the stationary state economy is that you can't have it when you've got interest-bearing debt, when you've got credit creation as a way of financing investment through society. And we, over 20 years, ecological economists have said the credit creation builds a growth imperative, and we can't get off a growth-based society until we get rid of credit creation. And we looked at that and actually found it not to be true. It's entirely possible, in fact, to have a completely stationary state with interest-bearing debt in the economic structure that we have. We tried to shock that system to show that actually even when you shock it out of its steady state, you can still get an element of stability back in it. And then we, looking at that, said, well, that's a bit too easy. Let's find the conditions under which we destabilize this economy. So we destabilized it by giving entrepreneurs and investors what Keynes once called animal spirits. So making them more bullish when the economy is going well and less likely to invest when it's going badly. And yes, indeed, you can destabilize a stationary state economy in the context of interest-bearing debt. Guess what? You can also do that with a growing economy, as we found out in the financial crisis. But here was one way of engaging with the difficulty of an economic transition that might not be based on growth. And we looked for a solution to that, and the place that we found it, actually, interestingly, was back in Keynes. If you engage in counter-cyclical spending by government, you can calm even a destabilizing economy in the stationary state. So that was a way, if you like, a simple illustration of how you have to engage with these challenges, how you have to take these impossibility theorems one after one, address them in a rigorous way, and look for the appropriate way of understanding what we have never had to understand before. An economy that stays within its ecological limits, that faces diminishing resources, in which growth itself is not available in the way that we thought it was in previous decades. One of the interesting things that comes out of this is that it does return a role to the state. And the political challenge, it's something I'm sure we can talk about in the discussion, is a huge one. It is, as I said, it was remarkable in a way, this distance that we've traveled between when the report was first published and so disliked by the government that it was written for, and the sense of that journey over the last almost decade, in which it's now possible, even within our own parliament in the UK, within various parties here in Denmark, with parties in the Green Party in the European Parliament, in the European Parliament itself, with commissioners present, it's now possible to have that conversation. And indeed, to put before them, as we did last week, a kind of a request. This is Thomas Jefferson talking about what the state is. The care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction, is the first and only object of good government. And that is something that is as resonant today and as important today as it was when he said it in 1809. But the request to that form of government is at least to take this post-growth challenge seriously. And this was a letter that was signed by 238 academics last week, published in 15 different languages, and now is the basis for a petition. You can sign it, requesting 4 very simple things at this stage in time. For goodness sake, let's face the challenge that we are being confronted with and set up something, maybe a commission, that would begin to understand the place where we are. Let's look at the architecture of the European Union and say, maybe it's not stability and growth that we should be focusing on, but stability and well-being. Because well-being can be sacrificed to the god of growth very, very easily, much too easily. What about a ministry for economic transition? What about something that looks definitively at where we need to go and begins to set in place the architecture that's associated with it? And finally, let's do as Robert Kennedy asked us to do, again, 50 years ago, to measure what matters. Very, very briefly, this is not an economy of hair shirt suffering and deprivation. One of the things that my research group has been aiming to do, essentially, is to figure out where the driving force for a new economy is. What is it that will draw people into it? And it's captured very well by Elise Boulding's comment she was the wife of Kenneth Boulding, who's famous for talking about Spaceship Earth, and drawing attention to some of these challenges. And she said, actually, for everything that we've gained through consumption, through a materialistic society, the freedoms available to us, we've actually also given up, including the ability to understand the happiness of not having things as well as the happiness of having things. And it's an interesting way of looking at our trajectory. If you kind of think of where we are, business as usual trajectory, which pursues more and more fun and enjoyment by having more and more stuff, is taking us to a dystopian future. But this hair shirt trajectory, where we just say, well, less stuff, guys, no fun, the society is over, is also not very attractive. So the obvious place that we want to be, the corner in which we achieve this idea of a better society, even with less throughput, is down here. And it can happen in all sorts of ways. My research group has been looking in particular at the idea of this corner as being about something to do with the concept of flow, of being involved in one's activities. Because actually that sense of involvement can be a higher satisfaction than simple accumulation of stuff. It can be a higher satisfaction than simply having more things. It can even be a higher satisfaction than the freedom of having more things. But we have to understand the psychology of that. Can we do that? Can we understand what these areas of human experience are which have a low environmental impact and a high definition in flow? And remarkably, we looked at a data set in the United States of people reporting on their physical activities and their sensations at the time. We mapped that against environmental impacts, and we found these 5 really key ways in which it's possible to think about a better life with more stuff. And they may strike you as absolutely obvious. Of course, when we're lost in the middle of romance, we're not too far away from the height of what it's possible to achieve in terms of intensity of satisfaction. And likewise in our physical activities, in our creativity, in our craft, and engaging with others. All of these things actually speak exactly to that sweet spot, an economy of care and craft and culture. They speak to what it means to be human and the potential that we have to live better with less. And the last one, which I like but isn't to everyone's satisfaction, is actually that there were a series of contemplative activities, mindfulness, prayer, meditation, reflection, that actually turned out to be amongst the most satisfying things with the least possible impact. So how do we get there from there? How do we get to this wonderful flow place? Flow is quite closely related to happiness. Happiness is known to be negatively correlated with materialism. And so we asked ourselves through a big data survey whether actually materialism was standing in the way of flow. And guess what? The red arrow is a negative influence. We found that materialism stands directly in the way of flow. Why is it that materialistic individuals find it harder to achieve this state of flow? One of the things that we knew helped with flow is this idea of self-regulatory strength, the strength of our intellectual and mental resources. The more of that you have, the more you can invest in the skills that you need to achieve flow. You can't just sit down, most people can't, and play the piano. You have to invest years of self-regulation into the skills that allow you to do it. So self-regulatory resources is one of the reasons why we might not get to flow. We know that self-regulatory resources do positively correlate with flow. Could it be that materialism is interfering with self-regulatory resources? And we carried out an experiment to expose people to materialistic primes and showed through a psychological measure that yes, it did in fact reduce their self-regulatory resources. What was the mechanism through which that happened? We wanted to know further. And one of the things that is known to reduce self-regulatory resources is an attempt to avoid negative feelings, the avoidance of undesirables. That is shown to have a depleting effect on self-regulatory resources. So in other words, by trying to escape from these things, the dark side, the challenges that face us, we're actually depleting the resources we need to escape from that challenge. And there, finally, actually was our map of this link of a materialistic society systematically encouraging people to undermine their own self-regulatory resources through this avoidance of difficult, negative, dark questions in society, and thereby undermining the potential for the society that we want, a society of flow, a society of better enjoyment, better lives with less stuff. And it isn't an accident that I come back to where I started from. There's an element of denial the avoidance of undesirables that sits at the heart of our failure to think critically about the post-growth challenge. That's a challenge to all of us. It's the challenge that I leave you with, and I hope that in that last very quick run through the psychological part of it, I have managed to convince you, at least in part, that the future actually is a brighter place than this dysfunctional system that we've inherited, that our kids can look forward to lives where it's possible to consume less and live better, that prosperity, with or without growth, is entirely possible. Thank you very much.